When our application becomes too big to all fit on a single visible area, we will separate things across multiple screens. And I'm using the word screen very informally, multiple screens of content. Now there's a technical aspect here. What do we actually add to the project to keep the right set of logic and data for each one? But beyond that, what's important here isn't just how do we add more screens to our app, it's also how do we navigate, how do we transition from one section of our app to another section and back again in a way that will make sense to a user. A lot of the choices we're going to make here are less about technical limitations and more about the nature of our app. Are we moving from screen to screen because we're drilling down into a hierarchy of nested information, or is it just because our app does 5 very different things and we need to switch from one to the other? So we're going to cover creating multiple screens or view controllers here, and then transitioning or segueing between them, wrapping navigation around them, and also see what's provided for both the built-in controls and even sample project templates to help us with this. In the examples we've done so far, we've focused on using the single view application project template in Xcode. That gives us a basic app beginning with a single view controller constructed in 2 pieces. One part in the storyboard, the scene, and its corresponding viewcontroller.swift file. And while it's certainly true that many applications on the App Store are built around a single view controller, just one screen of content, it's common to want multiple independent sections to your application, which we will do with multiple view controllers. So let's begin with the simplest example would be adding another view controller. We want to be able to move from our first screen to a second screen. Well, in our storyboard, we will add new scenes to represent each new part of the application. That's the benefit of storyboards. They can hold multiple scenes. They can represent the entirety of our application, all of our scenes, and, very importantly, the flow of the app, the relationships between these different pieces and how we transition from one to the other. But it's not just about adding a scene to the storyboard. We also need to add the corresponding Swift code file, the controller code for each new part of the application. If we want some custom behavior for that part of our app, we're going to need to add a new class and then also define how they are connected, how they are tied to each other. Now, when we created a new project, these things were already there. For that first scene and that first code file, they were already connected to each other. But that's only for the first one. When we want to add new scenes, new view controllers, we're going to have to do 3 things. First, we'll be adding a new scene to our storyboard. We can drag on one of the view controller objects from the object library. That'll represent the visual part, the view objects for this part of the app. Second, we'll add a new Swift class to our project. That'll be our controller code for that new scene. And very importantly, third, we need to connect the two. We need to point our scene at our new custom class, because without that, our scene on the storyboard won't know where its custom code is. It'll just be using the generic default class for a view controller. But once it's configured, that's still not enough. We also need to define how we will move from one section of our app to another, how the transition is done, or the official term is how we segue from one scene to another. And as you'll see, we have a few choices. There are different ways to do that, partly based on the navigational structure of your application and the reason that you're wanting to go from one section to another. So let's do one. I'll begin once again with a new single view application. I've created the project, but I haven't added anything to it yet. So over into the storyboard. I don't have an awful lot of room to see things. I'm going to collapse my document outline. And because I want to add a new view controller beside this one, I'm going to right-click a blank area of the canvas and zoom this down to 50% so I can see a little more. Open up the object library. And what I'm interested in here is the very top one, an object that represents an entire view controller. This will add a new view controller scene. Drag it on anywhere. You can put it to the left, to the right, above or below. It doesn't matter. The order in which the screens appear when your app is being used is based on the transitions you're going to define, not the order in which they appear on the storyboard. Now, if you can notice, there's an arrow on one of these. This is an indicator that this is the initial view controller. This one will be loaded first. You can change this in the inspectors. If I select this view controller and go to the attributes inspector, you see there's an option here for is initial view controller. So you can change it from one to the other. Now, for this demonstration, it will be worthwhile to have both of these controllers have a different colored background, just so it's obvious when we're moving from one to the other. So I'll change that. Easiest way is going to be open my document outline. For the first one, I'll select the view object, so I get the entire background highlighted. Come over to the attributes inspector and change the background here to, let's go for kind of a red-pink color there. And then select the other view controller scene and change its background to a blue. I'm going to just zoom out a bit just to verify that that looks like what we're expecting. Yep, that'll do. Right now, I have not added a new custom class for this new view controller that I've dragged on, this new scene. Technically, for this demonstration, I don't need one. It would work without it, because everything I'm going to do here doesn't require custom code yet. But I would suggest it's a very useful habit to get into, that as soon as you add a new scene onto a storyboard, you also add a corresponding Swift class for that scene. So I'm going to do that. Up to the File menu to Xcode, create a new file. The one that I'm interested in is under iOS. It is a Cocoa Touch class. I click Next. We can call it whatever we want here, but it's very important that we make this a subclass of the UI View Controller class. That's going to then have all the necessary pieces for us to provide some custom code. I'll just call it my second view controller, a subclass of UI View Controller. Now, there are quite a few more specialized view controllers in there, like table view controllers or collection view controllers, so make sure it's just a subclass of UI View Controller. Click Next, verify we're adding it to our project, and now we have this second view controller.swift in there. However, although I've dragged that onto the storyboard, I've created a new code file. Right now, there's no link between the two. What I need to do is select my new view controller, open up my inspectors, and go to the third one. It looks like an ID card. This is the Identity Inspector. And what I want to make sure is, sometimes we need to zoom back to 100% for this, that I select that first icon, which is the view controller, and it has an area here for custom class. If I don't change this, this scene is just going to be a standard default UI view controller that Apple have defined with no extra custom behavior. So I need to change this class to point to my new custom class, which was called second view controller. This is how we make the connection. However, I'm still in the issue that if we run this application right now, we would never see our second screen because there's nothing that would actually transition us to it, and there's no opportunity to run any code. So I need to define how we get there, how we get from the first screen to the second. It is possible to set that up in code, but it's also easy enough to do it with a control. So I'll open up my object library and drag on a button. One of the things I'm likely to find is that unless I'm in at 100%, I won't be able to do that. So drag on a button. I'll just place it over here. And we don't need to set this up as an outlet. We don't need to set it up as an action. What I need to do is make sure I can see both of my view controllers. And then I'm going to just hit Control and click and drag from the button over to the second view controller and let go. We get a pop-up asking what kind of segue do we want to do. So this is going to help me select from a different kind of visual transition from one screen to the next, as in, do I want this screen to move up from the bottom? Do I want it to push in from the right-hand side? If I was doing it on an iPad, would I like to show this new screen as a modal window and gray out some of the existing background rather than replace it? However, right now, it's not going to make much difference which one I select because several of these won't really do anything different unless I have a few other elements in place. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment, but just expect that without making a few more changes in my app, the choices here don't really make a visible difference. I will select the option called Show, the first one here. Now, Xcode adds a segue between these two view controllers. That segue shows up as a selectable item on the storyboard to both show me that there is a transition going on here and also allow me something to click I can select that. I can open up the inspectors. I even have attributes that I can change for this storyboard segue. I could select and delete it if I wanted to, but let's try it first. Command R. I get my first view controller, I have my button, but notice that the new view controller is going to move up from the bottom. That's not what I actually wanted. I wanted a push segue, which should move it in from the right to the left. So we have two problems right now. One is that I'm not getting the visual transition I was expecting. The other is that there's actually no way for me to go back. There's no automatic navigation here. Now, I could add a new button on this second screen and add a segue back to the first, but that would be clunky. I want a better way to navigate from the first screen to the second and back, and that's going to require me adding another element to this storyboard. One thing we must think about when we have multiple view controllers is handling the navigation between them. And there are two classic iOS methods to manage how we move between different view controllers in an app. The first one is using a navigation bar. Very useful when your view controllers represent multiple levels of hierarchy that you're drilling down when you move from screen to screen. If you've used the Settings application or the Mail application or about 1,000 others, you'll know this one. You launch an application and there's a bar at the top, usually with a title. And that bar stays fixed at the top. That's the navigation bar. Even if you have scrollable content within the screen, that bar doesn't scroll. Now, if you select an option on the first view controller, it'll transition you to another. And this is what's called a push segue. The new content, the new view controller, will push in from the right, and the navigation bar at the top will now have a breadcrumb link back to the previous screen. I could even go one level deeper again. The navigation bar at the top is smart enough to link to the title of the previous screen, and I could use it to go all the way down. I can use it to navigate all the way back up. But to understand how this navigation bar works, we need to know a little bit about how an application shows its view controllers. If we create a standard iOS app, like a single view application, then when our application is loaded and begins to run, the normal iOS application architecture, all this built-in functionality, which is doing a lot behind the scenes, it's going to create an object called a window, or officially a UI window. In iOS, a window is not an object you need to manually do much with. It is completely transparent. The reason it exists is for you to have a place to move your view controllers in and out of. So in that normal single view application, the window object loads, and it loads our first view controller into it, which contains our root view that takes up the entire screen, and then we load any additional view objects we've dragged onto that first scene, and it'll just stay like this for the lifetime of the application. Now, if you add a second view controller and you perform a simple segue between the two, like the one we just did, then when that segue is triggered and the second view controller is moved into the window, the first view controller is moved out of the window. However, if you decide instead to use the navigation bar option, things are a little different. So there is an iOS object called a navigation controller. It's a special kind of view controller all by itself, and it's not intended for you to customize. It's just intended for you to use. Now, unlike a normal view controller, when we use it, it does not take up the entire screen. It's mostly transparent. It really is just the navigation bar. So when you're using this option, you're not adding a navigation bar at the top of each of your view controllers. Instead, you choose to use this standard navigation controller to manage all of yours. And when your application loads, it's the navigation controller that is the first thing loaded into the window. Now, you won't ever see the empty white area here, as it's going to immediately load your first view controller in underneath it. So the navigation bar stays over the top. Then when you select something and you segue to the next view controller, well, instead of the entire window being replaced, the navigation controller just stays where it is, and it takes care of animating in the second view in controller underneath the navigation bar, doing that push segue from right to the left. It'll also generate a back button up to the previous level, and it can do this for multiple levels of view controllers, and it'll do it automatically. And that's the great thing about the navigation controller. It will keep track of these multiple levels. When you want to move down, we're going to be adding a new view controller, what's called pushing a view controller onto the stack. When we click that back button, we're going to pop one off the stack. The navigation controller will take care of all of that. And luckily, it's really easy to add, even if we have an existing storyboard with multiple view controllers on it. So let's do that. We had this simple setup, the two view controllers just with different colored backgrounds with a button that performs a segue from the first to the second. And I'd like you to remember that the segue here is animating in the second screen from the bottom to the top. Now, adding the navigation controller to this picture couldn't be simpler. I simply want to select the first view controller here and choose Editor, Embed in Navigation Controller. And that's it. Now I've added a navigation controller to the storyboard, and it's going to show up as my initial view controller. You see the arrow here pointing to the navigation controller. This is just a placeholder. We're going to have this gray area, but that's really going to show up transparent. The only thing that is going to be the case is the navigation bar. It knows that it's going to include our first view controller. We've even got the emulated navigation bar here, so we can start to lay out our own view controllers a bit more usefully. So I need to be a bit more careful about positioning things on my own view controllers and stay aware of the fact that I'll now have this navigation bar floating over at the top that will, by default, overlay the top contents of my own view controllers. So we run this. We get the navigation bar at the top. I can segue and go to the next screen. But if you notice that, unlike a moment ago when there was no way for me to transition back to the previous screen, we now automatically have the breadcrumbs at the top of the navigation bar. We're also getting the push segue that I wanted. It's moving in from the right-hand side. That's all being taken care of. But I would like a title to show up in the bar here, and that's pretty easy too. Now, even though I want the title to appear on the navigation bar, which is part of the navigation controller, the way I'm going to do it is provide that title information from my view controllers themselves. So I'll go into the code file for my first view controller, just viewcontroller.swift, and in the viewDidLoad method, after the call to super, I'm just going to say self.title equals first VC, copy that line, jump over into second view controller, do something basically identical, Command R to run, and by providing that simple code, we now have title information on our navigation bar. The breadcrumb title has changed as well. So the navigation controller is very aware of the properties of the view controllers that you're asking it to load in. That's how it can keep track of this. We have our navigation, we have our titles. But it is true that even when we have multiple view controllers, we're not always trying to describe a hierarchical relationship like this where we're drilling down from one screen into the next. Sometimes we just want to switch between different parts of the application. So in the next clip, I'll show you another way we can do that. There's another built-in controller object that will help us switch between having multiple view controllers, and that's the tab bar controller that adds the tab bar at the bottom of our screen with multiple choices, up to 5. Things like the clock application, the music application, iTunes, the App Store, the phone application. They all use that tab bar to switch between different view controllers, to switch between different parts of the application. Some apps use the tab bar as well as the navigation bar. In the health application, for example, you can use the tab bar to switch between different sections of the app, but within those sections, say in the health data section, it's also using table views nested inside a navigation controller so we can drill down multiple levels. So it's not an either-or situation. Sometimes it's both. And the simplest way to get to grips with the tab bar controller is to create a new project in Xcode using not the single view application, but the tabbed application project type. This creates a basic application using a tab bar. And if I jump us over into the storyboard, I'll shrink this down a little bit so we can see it. There's 3 scenes on the storyboard. The tab bar controller is at the top. It gives us the option to load in 2 different view controllers. So we'll get 2 tabs on the tab bar, just the way that this is right out of the box. Switch between first view and go to second view. Jumping back over, I'll go to the Project Navigator. You might notice that we've been given Swift classes here for the first view controller and the second view controller. So we do have custom classes, even though there isn't any special code in either of these. The tab bar controller shouldn't need a custom class. It's just not necessary. Now, conceptually, what we're doing here is very similar to the idea of using a navigation controller, in that the tab bar controller now will be loaded first. It is the initial view controller. I see the arrow here. So it gets loaded, but most of it is transparent. It'll keep the tab bar at the bottom of the screen, and it'll immediately load in the first view controller underneath it, giving us the option to switch between it and the second view and anything else that we had. Now, one difference is when we are using this, when we're switching, when we hit the different tabs, we don't animate to a different view controller, we simply jump right to it. So how do we add a new section to this? Well, we add a new view controller. So back to the storyboard, I will shrink this down even smaller to 25%, open up the object library, and drag on a new view controller. I want to be able to recognize this, so I'm going to put a label on. To interact with it properly, I'm going to have to zoom back in. Drag on a label, set its contents, increase the font, resize it. I'm going to drag it roughly into the center, using the grid lines to help me get it centered. But if I want it to be centered, I'm going to choose the auto layout option to lock it down here, down at the very bottom right button here. Hit the Resolve Auto Layout Issues and hit Reset to Suggested Constraints. Now, we have just dragged on a new view controller scene into our storyboard, but it's a good idea to add a new class for this scene. So back up to the File menu, New File. This will be a Cocoa Touch class. I'll call it Third View Controller, and it needs to be a subclass of UI View Controller. Click Next, Create. And jumping back in the storyboard, I've only done 2 of the 3 necessary steps, so I need to select my third view controller scene. With that selected, jump to my Attributes Inspector. I want to make sure I've got my view controller here. Let's zoom back into 100%. Select the first icon. It should right now have the grayed out sign of UI View Controller, meaning it's just using the default class, and I need to connect this to my new class, which I called Third View Controller. However, right now, this third view controller is unreachable. It is simply floating out here in a detached part of the storyboard. We need to connect it to the tab bar controller, and that's actually very easy. Making sure that I can see everything, I just use Control Drag. I click on the tab bar controller, Control and drag down to the third view controller and let go. I get some segue options. The one that we want here is just the Relationship Segue View Controllers option. Because I don't want to animate a transition. It's not a push. We're not drilling down a level. We don't need any modal behavior. We're just switching from one tab to another tab. And it's a continual relationship between the tab bar controller and our new view controllers, as well as all the others. So it's just this relationship segue. That gets added. I see that there's actually now a third option in the tab bar controller. And if I look at the bottom of my new view controller, I also get an element there. I'll hit Command R to run this. And it's working. We have the first section, we have the second, and we have the third. Although we do have a rather sad-looking slot for our third tab. We just have the word item and a blank space. So I'll stop this. To change the information that actually shows up on the tabs, on the tab bar, what icon, what text, you might think that you'd go to the storyboard and select the tab bar controller itself and see if there's any properties that we could change, but that's not the case. What we need to do is affect any of those settings through the individual screens. So if I wanted to change the icon for the second tab, I get to it through the second view controller. If I want to change the icon for the third one, I get to it through the third view controller. I'll zoom back in again to 100% to make it reliable that we're interacting with this. And I should be able to grab the item itself on my third view controller. We see that it changes to a tab bar item here. You do have the option to change to a few of the popular built-in options like more and favorites and top rated, contacts, that kind of thing, and you'll get the default icon and the default text showing up. But there is also a custom option where we can provide our own artwork. We can drag it into the project, and then we'll be able to select that artwork in our storyboard. We have 3 icons, we have 3 tabs, we're switching between 3 view controllers. And it's worth pointing out that although the tabbed application project in Xcode is an easy starting point, if you want to use the tab bar controller, you don't have to create a new project to do it. You can find it in the object library and just drag this on to any storyboard. The fundamental building block of an iOS app is view controllers, the combination of the user interface for that part of the app and the code for that part of the app. Now, when adding to a storyboard, there are 3 pieces to do this. We'd add a new scene to a storyboard, we'd add a new class that inherits from UI view controller, and then, very importantly, we'll connect those 2 pieces. And after creating them, we can define our own segues between our view controllers. But we also saw using things like the navigation controller, a built-in object of iOS that wraps around our view controllers. It does a great job of managing a stack of view controllers, presenting their titles, keeping track of where we are in the stack so it can automatically offer the right way to navigate back. But the navigation controller is really suited to hierarchical information, that we're moving between screens because we're drilling down multiple levels. And we used and configured the tab bar controller to switch between separate view controllers of an app, keeping each one self-contained but without suggesting a relationship between them. Now, these aren't mutually exclusive. Applications can use both a tab bar and a navigation controller. Now, as an extra credit, take a look at the master detail project template in Xcode. This includes both a navigation controller and a pre-configured table view. When you write an iOS app, it